A successful businessman, grieving his wife's death, hires a young orphan to care for his daughter. What happens next will change all their lives forever. But when a tragic fire threatens to tear their family apart, dark secrets and hidden motives come to light. Can this unconventional family survive the betrayal, uncover the truth, and heal the wounds of their past? Trust, love, and resilience are put to the ultimate test. Will they be able to rebuild, or is it too late? Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future updates. The early evening sky over Charlotte, North Carolina glimmered with the faint remnants of sunset, streaks of orange and purple reflecting on the glassy high-rises. Nathaniel Nate Carter sat in the driver's seat of his car, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. His hands were steady, as they always were, but his mind churned with thoughts that felt anything but controlled. The successful tech entrepreneur whose company had recently expanded to national acclaim should have felt triumphant. Instead, there was a hollow ache in his chest, a reminder of the loss that no amount of professional success could fill. It had been 2 years since Amelia's passing. She had been the heart of their home, a radiant light that made their family feel whole. Now, it was just him and Emily, his 7-year-old daughter. She was his everything, but Nate couldn't help feeling like he was failing her. Between the late-night meetings, endless deadlines, and the grief he tried to suppress, he wasn't sure he was enough. Tonight, as he drove to a local diner to escape the suffocating silence of their home, Nate felt the weight of his inadequacies pressing down harder than ever. A few miles away, Michelle Foster tugged her jacket tighter against the crisp evening air. She was tired, bone-tired. The double shifts at the diner left her feet aching and her hands raw from scrubbing plates. At only 18, Michelle had already lived a life filled with more hardship than most would see in a lifetime. The foster care system had taught her to fend for herself, but it also left her with scars, both visible and unseen. Tonight, as she left her shift, she was simply grateful for the warm meal in her backpack, a leftover from the diner that would serve as her dinner and breakfast. She didn't see the black car parked in the shadows of the lot until she heard a muffled shout. Startled, Michelle froze, her eyes darting to the source of the noise. 2 figures loomed near the car, their movements aggressive and hurried. One man, slightly taller, had his arm raised, poised to strike the figure slumped against the vehicle. Without thinking, Michelle reached for the heavy wrench in her bag, an old tool she kept for emergencies. Her heart raced as she stepped closer, adrenaline drowning out her fear. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice steadier than she felt. "Leave him alone!" The taller assailant turned, his face hidden in the dim light. "Mind your business, girl," he growled, taking a step toward her. Michelle raised the wrench higher, her stance firm. "I said, leave him alone!" The distraction was enough. The man slumped against the car. Nate took advantage of the moment, shoving his attacker away. The sound of tires screeching echoed through the lot as the 2 men scrambled into a getaway car, their curses fading into the distance. For a moment, silence fell. Michelle stood frozen, her grip on the wrench tightening as she watched Nate stagger to his feet. He brushed shards of glass from his jacket, his breathing heavy, and turned to face her. You okay?" Michelle asked, her voice trembling slightly now that the danger had passed. Nate stared at her, his deep brown eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. "I think the better question is, are you okay? You didn't have to—" "Yeah, well, I couldn't just stand by," Michelle interrupted, shifting awkwardly. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head, though his hand instinctively went to his ribs. "Just shaken, thank you. Really." Michelle waved it off, already stepping back. "You should probably get that window fixed. This isn't exactly the safest part of town." Nate's brow furrowed as he took her in. Her worn jacket, the faint smudges of grease on her hands, the tiredness etched into her expression. "I mean it. You saved me. The least I can do is—" "Don't worry about it." Michelle cut him off again. "Glad you're okay. Take care." As she turned to leave, Nate felt a strange pull, something telling him this wasn't the end of their interaction. "Wait," he called after her. "What's your name?" Michelle paused, hesitating before glancing over her shoulder. "Michelle," she said simply, before disappearing into the shadows of the lot. Nate stood there for a moment, her name echoing in his mind. He climbed back into his car, his hands still shaking slightly as he started the engine. For the first time in a long while, the hollow ache in his chest felt a little less suffocating. The encounter was strange, unexpected, but it wasn't meaningless. He didn't know it yet, but this night would set the course of his life onto a path he never could have anticipated. The encounter from the previous night lingered in Nate Carter's mind like a haunting melody. Every time he glanced at the shattered window of his car, he thought of her, Michelle, the young woman with fiery resolve in her eyes and a courage he couldn't quite understand. She had saved him without hesitation, risking herself for a stranger. Nate couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason, though he wasn't yet sure what that reason was. The morning sun poured through the tall windows of his sleek office, casting long shadows on the polished floors. Nate sat behind his desk, absent-mindedly flipping through the latest quarterly report. But his focus was elsewhere, on the crayon drawing Emily had given him before school, now pinned to the corner of his desk. It was a simple picture of their family, Emily, himself, and a faintly sketched outline of her late mother, Amelia, floating above them with angel wings. Emily's longing was etched in every line, every color. He felt the pang of inadequacy return, sharper than ever. His thoughts were interrupted by his assistant's voice through the intercom. "Mr. Carter, there's a Michelle Foster here to see you. Says you asked her to stop by?" Nate straightened, surprised but strangely relieved. "Send her in." The door opened and Michelle stepped inside. Her posture was guarded, her expression unreadable. She wore the same worn jacket from the night before, though she'd tried to smooth her hair into a neat ponytail. The room's opulence contrasted starkly with her unassuming presence, but she didn't flinch. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, cutting straight to the point. Nate stood, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. "Please, have a seat." She hesitated, then sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'm guessing this isn't about fixing your car." Nate smiled faintly, appreciating her bluntness. "No, it's not. Look, I've been thinking about what happened last night, about you." Michelle's brow furrowed, suspicion flickering across her face. "If you're about to offer me money, don't bother. I didn't help you for a reward." "I know," Nate replied quickly. "That's not why I asked you here, but after last night I started thinking, maybe I can help you." Michelle leaned back slightly, crossing her arms. "Help me? With what?" Nate hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I have a 7-year-old daughter, Emily. She's everything to me, but she's struggling. I'm struggling. Since my wife passed, it's been hard, harder than I'd like to admit. Emily needs someone who can be there for her in ways I can't right now." Michelle's eyes softened, but her tone remained skeptical. "And you think that's me?" "Yes," Nate said firmly. "I saw how fearless you were last night, how you stepped in without hesitation. Emily needs someone brave, someone who's seen the world for what it is but hasn't let it break them. That's what I saw in you." Michelle let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "You don't even know me. I could be anyone." Nate leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I trust my instincts, and my instincts tell me you're the right person. I'm offering you a job, a stable income, a safe place to stay, and the chance to help someone who needs you." Michelle stared at him, her emotions a mix of disbelief and temptation. The offer was too good to be true, and yet there was no trace of insincerity in his voice. But the scars of her past warned her to be cautious. "I don't know anything about taking care of kids," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "You'll learn," Nate assured her. "All I'm asking is that you try." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them. Michelle felt a familiar ache in her chest, the longing for a home, for purpose, for something more than just surviving. She studied Nate's face, searching for any sign of ulterior motive, but found none. Instead, she saw a man who was doing his best, even when he felt like it wasn't enough. "I'll think about it," she finally said, her voice steady but guarded. "This is a lot." Nate nodded, respect in his expression. "Take all the time you need. Here's my card. Call me when you're ready." As she left his office, Michelle's fingers brushed against the embossed letters on the card. Nathaniel Carter, CEO. She slipped it into her pocket, her mind swirling with uncertainty and a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in years. Nate watched her go, a sense of calm washing over him. For the first time in months, it felt like he'd taken a step toward fixing the broken pieces of his life. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. Michelle Foster stared at the small suitcase sitting at her feet. It wasn't much, just a few changes of clothes, a worn notebook she used as a journal, and a picture of her parents she'd kept since the day their car accident had changed everything. Taking Nathaniel Carter's offer felt like stepping into another world, one so foreign and unfamiliar it almost didn't feel real. But there was a strange pull, a whisper of possibility she couldn't ignore. Maybe this could be her chance to build something new, a life that wasn't just about survival. The Carter household was everything Michelle had imagined it would be. Grand, polished, and intimidatingly perfect. The white brick colonial house in Charlotte's Dilworth neighborhood stood tall and pristine, with a sprawling garden and a porch that seemed to wrap around the world. As she climbed the steps, she felt the weight of every judgmental glance she'd endured over the years. People like her didn't belong in places like this. Nathaniel greeted her at the door with a warm smile. "Welcome, Michelle," he said, stepping aside to let her in. His voice held no hint of the pity or condescension she'd braced herself for. Instead, it was filled with something unexpected, genuine gratitude. The first thing Michelle noticed inside was how quiet the house felt. Too quiet for a home with a child. The air was still, almost heavy, as though it had forgotten how to breathe. "Emily's at school," Nate explained, noticing her glance toward the empty living room. "She'll be back soon. I thought it might be easier for you to settle in before she gets home." Michelle nodded, grateful for the space to adjust. Nate gestured toward an older woman emerging from the kitchen, her face a careful mask of neutrality. "This is Deborah. She's been with us since Emily was born." Deborah wiped her hands on a dish towel, her eyes sharp as they scanned Michelle from head to toe. "It's nice to meet you," Michelle said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Deborah gave a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Likewise." The introduction was brief, but Michelle could feel the undercurrent of skepticism radiating from Deborah. It was a look Michelle knew all too well, the kind that said, "I'm watching you." As Nate led Michelle to her room, a small but cozy space tucked away on the second floor, she tried to shake the feeling of being scrutinized. The room was simple, with light blue walls and a window that overlooked the garden. It was far more than she'd ever had, and yet it felt suffocating, like it might all disappear if she blinked too hard. "I know this is a big change," Nate said, leaning against the doorframe. "If you need anything at all, just let me know." Michelle forced a small smile. "Thanks. I'll be fine." When Emily returned from school that afternoon, the quiet of the house was replaced with a burst of energy. The little girl barreled through the front door, her curls bouncing as she flung her backpack onto the floor. "Daddy, guess what? We learned about dinosaurs today. Did you know they had feathers?" Her enthusiasm was contagious, and Michelle couldn't help but smile as she watched from the doorway. Nate knelt to Emily's level, laughing. "Feathers? I thought they were all scaly." "Not all of them," Emily said, her hands flying as she mimicked a dinosaur in flight. Her eyes flicked toward Michelle, curiosity lighting up her face. "Who's that?" Nate stood, placing a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Emily, this is Michelle. She's going to be helping us out for a while." Emily tilted her head, studying Michelle with the same sharpness she often used on her favorite puzzles. "Hi," she said at last, her voice soft but bright. "Do you like dinosaurs?" Michelle grinned, kneeling down so they were at eye level. "I do. I think the Triceratops is pretty cool." Emily's eyes widened. "Me too. They're the best." She grabbed Michelle's hand, pulling her toward the living room. "Come on, I'll show you my dinosaur book." As Emily excitedly flipped through the pages, Michelle found herself relaxing for the first time since she'd arrived. The little girl's joy was infectious, and for a moment the weight of her past felt lighter. But the ease didn't last. Later that evening, as Michelle helped Emily with her homework, she caught sight of Deborah watching from the kitchen doorway. The older woman's arms were crossed, her expression unreadable. When Emily left to grab a snack, Deborah stepped into the room. "I just want to make one thing clear," she said, her tone low but firm. "Emily has been through enough. I won't let anyone hurt her, not even unintentionally." Michelle straightened, meeting Deborah's gaze without flinching. "I understand," she said quietly. "I know what it's like to lose people you love. I wouldn't do anything to make it harder for her." Deborah studied her for a long moment, then gave a small nod before turning away. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't outright rejection either. For now, that was enough. As the evening drew to a close, Michelle sat by her window looking out at the garden below. The house was quiet again, but this time it didn't feel so heavy. She thought of Emily's laughter, Nate's kindness, and even Deborah's guarded warnings. For the first time in years, she felt the faint stirrings of hope, a fragile, tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, this place could become something more. The faint light of dawn streamed through the window, casting soft golden hues on the walls of Michelle's room. She had spent the night tossing and turning, her thoughts tangled with the events of the previous day. Emily's unguarded warmth, Nate's earnestness, and even Deborah's cautious warnings all lingered in her mind. For years, Michelle had lived her life one day at a time, never daring to dream of a future. But here in this house, there was a flicker of something she couldn't quite define, something that felt dangerously like belonging. But as she unpacked the few belongings she had brought with her, a familiar unease settled over her. Tucked at the bottom of her suitcase was a worn envelope with her name scrawled across it in slanted handwriting. She recognized it immediately. It was from Ellie. Ellie. The name alone carried a weight that Michelle hadn't felt in years. Her sister had been a constant presence during their childhood, their bond unbreakable even as the foster system tried to tear them apart. But Ellie had always been the rebellious one, constantly running from one bad decision to the next. Their paths had diverged sharply when Michelle was 16, leaving her to navigate the world alone. Michelle sat on the edge of her bed staring at the envelope as if it might bite. The letter had arrived weeks ago, but she hadn't been able to bring herself to open it. Now, with her life seemingly taking a new direction, the sight of it felt like a shadow creeping in, threatening to pull her back into a past she had fought hard to escape. A knock at the door startled her, and she quickly shoved the letter under her pillow. "Come in," she called, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. The door creaked open and Nate's head appeared. "Hey, Emily's ready for breakfast, and I thought you might want to join us." Michelle forced a smile, pushing the thoughts of Ellie aside. "Sure, I'll be right down." Breakfast was lively, with Emily excitedly recounting her dreams from the night before. "And then the Triceratops turned into a unicorn and flew away," she exclaimed, her curls bouncing as she waved her arms for emphasis. Michelle chuckled, her tension easing in the face of Emily's boundless energy. Even Deborah, standing by the stove, seemed less guarded this morning. The aroma of fresh pancakes filled the kitchen, and for a brief moment, everything felt normal. But the peace didn't last. Later that afternoon, as Michelle was folding laundry in her room, she heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. She peered out the window, her heart stopping when she saw Ellie stepping out of a beat-up sedan, her leather jacket and messy ponytail as familiar as the memories Michelle had tried to bury. The doorbell rang, and before Michelle could react, Deborah's voice echoed through the house. "There's someone here to see you, Michelle." Taking a deep breath, Michelle made her way to the door. Ellie stood in the foyer, her arms crossed and a smirk on her face. "Hey, little sister," she said, her voice laced with a mix of affection and defiance. "Long time no see." Michelle's stomach tightened. "What are you doing here, Ellie?" "Got your address from the letter I sent. Figured I'd drop by since you didn't bother writing back." Ellie's tone was casual, but her eyes held something sharper, something that felt like accusation. Nate entered the room then, his expression curious but neutral. "Everything okay?" he asked, glancing between the two women. Michelle forced a smile. "Yeah, this is my sister Ellie." Ellie extended a hand, her smile charming but calculated. Nice to meet you. You must be the guy giving my sister this fancy setup. Nate hesitated, clearly taken aback by Ellie's bluntness, but shook her hand politely. Nathaniel Carter, he said. Welcome. As the three of them stood in awkward silence, Emily peeked around the corner, her curiosity getting the better of her. Who's that? She asked. Ellie's expression softened as she crouched to Emily's level. I'm your Aunt Ellie, she said with a grin. Bet you didn't know you had one of those. Emily giggled, her innocence cutting through the tension like a ray of sunlight. But Michelle's mind was spinning. Ellie's sudden arrival was anything but innocent, and she had a sinking feeling that her sister's reappearance would bring more trouble than she was ready to handle. That evening, as the house grew quiet, Michelle sat on her bed, clutching Ellie's unopened letter. Her sister's presence had stirred up emotions she thought she had buried. Guilt, resentment, and a flicker of longing for the connection they had once shared. Michelle finally tore the envelope open, her hands trembling. The words inside were brief but heavy. Michelle, I know I messed up, but I'm trying to make things right. Please let me in. Ellie. The letter blurred as tears filled Michelle's eyes. She wanted to believe Ellie's words, but years of disappointment had taught her to be cautious. Yet as she folded the letter and tucked it back under her pillow, a small part of her wondered if this was her chance, not just to reconnect with her sister, but to finally confront the shadows of her past. Ellie's sudden arrival had left Michelle on edge, her emotions tangled in a web of unease and hope. Though she tried to focus on her responsibilities, Ellie's presence in the house lingered like a storm cloud, ready to break. It wasn't just the tension between them. It was the disruption of the fragile balance Michelle had begun to find. Every conversation felt like walking on eggshells, and Michelle could sense Nate and Deborah's silent concern growing. The next morning, Ellie lounged on the living room couch, her leather jacket draped over the armrest. She flipped through a magazine, her demeanor casual, but Michelle knew better. Ellie never did anything without a reason. So, how's life in paradise? Ellie asked, her tone laced with sarcasm as Michelle entered the room. Michelle ignored the jab, busying herself with straightening the cushions on a nearby chair. It's fine. Busy. Busy playing house? Ellie smirked. I mean, come on, Michelle, a live-in nanny, this isn't you. Michelle stiffened, her patience thinning. What would you know about me anymore, Ellie? You haven't been around in years. Ellie's smirk faltered, a flicker of hurt crossing her face. I'm here now, aren't I? Before Michelle could respond, Emily bounded into the room holding a stack of drawings. Aunt Ellie, look what I made. Ellie grinned, her mood shifting as she leaned forward to admire the colorful crayon creations. Wow, kiddo, you're pretty talented. I think this one belongs in a museum. Emily giggled, her laughter a balm to the tension that had hung in the air moments earlier. Michelle watched silently, conflicted. Ellie had always been good with kids, better even than she was with adults. It was part of why their bond as children had been so strong. But the reprieve was short-lived. That afternoon, while Michelle was helping Emily with her school project, Nate appeared in the doorway, his expression strained. Michelle, can we talk? She followed him to the study, where he closed the door behind them. The room felt heavy with unspoken words as Nate gestured for her to sit. What's going on with Ellie? He asked, his tone careful but firm. Michelle hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. She's my sister, she said simply. We've had a complicated relationship. Nate leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. Complicated is one thing, but she's been here for 2 days and hasn't said why. I need to know if her being here is going to cause problems. Michelle met his gaze, feeling a pang of guilt. I don't know why she's here, she admitted. But I'll talk to her. I promise. Nate studied her for a moment, then nodded. Okay, but Michelle, I've got enough on my plate with work right now. I can't afford any distractions. The mention of work brought a flicker of concern to Michelle's face. Is something wrong? Nate sighed, leaning back in his chair. Michael Porter. He's been stirring up trouble, threatening lawsuits, spreading rumors about the company. It's nothing I can't handle, but it's draining. Michelle frowned, her worry deepening. Is there anything I can do to help? Nate shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You're already helping more than you know. That evening, Michelle confronted Ellie in the guest room, her frustration finally bubbling over. Why are you really here? She demanded, her voice low but firm. Ellie shrugged, her arms crossed. I told you, I'm trying to fix things. Fix what, Ellie? You disappeared for years and now you just show up out of the blue? What do you expect me to do, trust you? Ellie's eyes flashed with anger, but there was something else there too. Pain. You think I don't know I messed up? That I don't regret leaving you alone? I've been trying to get my life together, Michelle. I wanted to see if there was still room for me in yours. Michelle's heart ached at the rawness in Ellie's voice, but she wasn't ready to let her guard down. This isn't just about me anymore, she said quietly. There's a little girl in this house who's been through enough. If you're staying, you'd better be serious about this. Ellie nodded, her expression softening. I am, I promise. The next day, as Michelle helped Emily get ready for school, Deborah approached her in the hallway. I don't mean to pry, Deborah began, her tone uncharacteristically gentle. But is your sister going to be staying long? I'm not sure, Michelle admitted, but I'll make sure she doesn't cause any trouble. Deborah studied her for a moment, then nodded. For Emily's sake, I hope you do. As Michelle watched Ellie interact with Emily later that day, she couldn't deny the glimmers of good in her sister. But trust was a fragile thing, and with Nate's business troubles looming and Ellie's intentions still unclear, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that the brewing conflicts in her life were far from over. Tension in the Carter household simmered beneath the surface, its presence subtle but undeniable. Ellie's unexpected arrival had thrown Michelle's new life off balance, while Nate's mounting work stress seeped into his interactions. Even Emily, usually a bright light of innocence, seemed to pick up on the unease, her usual chatter more subdued. Michelle tried to hold it all together, but the cracks in her armor grew wider each day. It was during one of these tense evenings that everything changed. The night started quietly enough. Nate had retired early to his study, working on a critical proposal to counter Michael Porter's ongoing attacks. Emily was in her room coloring pictures of dinosaurs, and Michelle was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. Ellie had gone out earlier, and her absence added to the strained quiet that hung over the house. Michelle was scrubbing a pan when the first faint whiff of smoke reached her nose. She paused, her brow furrowing. At first, she thought it might be from outside, someone burning leaves or grilling. But then, a faint crackling sound reached her ears. Her heart rate quickened as she moved toward the hallway. The smoke was thicker there, a curling gray mist that seemed to grow denser with every second. Panic surged in her chest. Emily, she called, her voice sharp with urgency. She ran toward Emily's room, her footsteps loud against the hardwood floors. Throwing open the door, she saw the little girl sitting on her bed, her coloring book forgotten as her wide eyes locked on the smoke creeping under her door. Come here, Michelle urged, rushing forward and scooping Emily into her arms. We need to get out of here. The hallway was worse now, the smoke dark and suffocating. Michelle wrapped her arms tightly around Emily, shielding her as best she could. She coughed, her throat burning with every breath. Stay close to me, okay? She whispered to Emily, her voice raspy but firm. The stairs were blocked by flames, the fire roaring with an intensity that sent waves of heat radiating through the house. Michelle's mind raced, searching for an escape. Then she remembered the oak tree outside Emily's window. She ran back into Emily's room, slamming the door shut to buy them a moment. We're going to climb out the window, she said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. You just need to hold on tight, okay? Emily nodded, her face pale but trusting. Michelle pushed the window open, coughing as fresh air hit her face. The oak tree's branches were close enough to reach if she stretched. She hoisted Emily onto the sill, making sure the girl's grip on her was secure. Hold on to me and don't let go, Michelle said, her voice steady but urgent. We're going to climb down together. With Emily clinging to her back, Michelle reached for the nearest branch. The bark scraped her hands, but she ignored the pain, focusing only on getting Emily to safety. Inch by inch, she maneuvered down the tree, her arms trembling under the weight and effort. The night air was filled with the sound of sirens as they reached the ground. Neighbors had gathered on the lawn, their faces etched with concern and fear. Michelle collapsed to her knees, her arms still wrapped around Emily, who was coughing but otherwise unharmed. "Michelle!" Nate's voice rang out as he sprinted toward them, his face pale and frantic. He dropped to his knees beside them, pulling Emily into his arms. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" "We're fine," Michelle managed between coughs, her voice hoarse. "The fire, it started so fast." Paramedics rushed forward, checking both Michelle and Emily for injuries. Nate stood beside them, his expression a mix of relief and guilt. "You saved her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You saved my daughter." Michelle shook her head, her exhaustion and adrenaline making her words stumble. I couldn't let anything happen to her." As the paramedics ushered them toward an ambulance, Michelle caught sight of Ellie standing at the edge of the crowd. Her sister's face was pale, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and something Michelle couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe. Ellie stepped forward but stopped short, as if unsure whether she belonged in the scene unfolding before her. Later, as they sat in the hospital waiting room, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that the fire wasn't an accident. Something about how quickly it spread, how deliberate it seemed, gnawed at the edges of her mind. But she didn't voice her suspicions. Not yet. For now, all that mattered was that Emily was safe. When Nate approached her, his gratitude evident in his every word and gesture, Michelle realized something had shifted between them. The walls she had built around herself, walls forged by years of pain and self-reliance, had begun to crack, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, she could let someone in. The aftermath of the fire left an unshakable tension in the Carter household. Though the immediate danger had passed, its shadows lingered in every interaction, every conversation. Nate's relief over Emily's safety was tempered by growing questions about how the fire had started. For Michelle, the night had left her physically drained but emotionally raw. She couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that the blaze was more than a tragic accident. In the days that followed, the house hummed with activity. Contractors arrived to assess the damage, insurance agents filed their reports, and Sheriff Calvin Reeves stopped by to speak with Nate about the investigation. Despite the commotion, Michelle noticed Ellie keeping a low profile, her usual bravado replaced by an unusual quietness. Michelle couldn't tell if it was guilt or something else. One afternoon, Michelle found herself in the kitchen with Deborah, who had been unusually reserved since the fire. Deborah's sharp gaze followed Michelle as she prepared Emily's snack, her silence louder than words. Finally, Deborah spoke. "That was a brave thing you did," she said, her tone neutral but tinged with something softer. Michelle glanced up, caught off guard by the comment. "I just did what anyone would have done." Deborah folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "Not everyone would have risked their life. You've proven you care about Emily, but I still need to know something." She paused, her voice dropping. "Why are you really here, Michelle?" The question stung more than Michelle expected. "I'm here because Nate offered me a chance I've never had before. I care about Emily. I care about this family. Isn't that enough?" Deborah didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied Michelle with the same piercing gaze she'd had since the day they met. "Time will tell," she said finally, before leaving the room. Later that evening, Nate called Michelle into his study. His face was drawn, his usual calm demeanor replaced with unease. He gestured for her to sit, and she complied, her stomach tightening at the sight of the folder on his desk. "We need to talk," he began, his voice steady but edged with something she couldn't quite place. "Sheriff Reeves found evidence that the fire wasn't an accident." Michelle's heart sank. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was another thing entirely. "Do they know who started it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nate shook his head. "Not yet. But Reeves mentioned something troubling." He hesitated, his eyes locking onto hers. "They found traces of accelerant near the back door, and he said it looked like someone tried to force their way in." Michelle felt a chill run down her spine. "You think someone did this on purpose?" "I don't know," Nate admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But I need to ask, do you think Ellie could have had anything to do with it?" The question hit Michelle like a blow. "Ellie?" she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "No, She might have made some bad choices in the past, but she would never hurt anyone. Nate's expression softened slightly. I want to believe that. But Ellie's sudden arrival, her reluctance to explain why she's here, it doesn't look good, Michelle. Michelle's throat tightened. She had spent years defending Ellie, excusing her mistakes, but this accusation was different. She's my sister, Michelle said, her voice firm despite the doubt creeping in. She's all the family I have left. Nate nodded, his gaze steady. I understand that, but I have to protect Emily. If there's even a chance Ellie is involved, she's not, Michelle interrupted, her voice rising. She wouldn't. The room fell silent, the weight of their conversation hanging heavily between them. Nate finally leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. For your sake, I hope you're right. That night, Michelle found Ellie sitting on the back porch, staring out into the darkness. Did you do it? Michelle asked bluntly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Ellie turned, her expression a mix of shock and hurt. What? The fire, Michelle said, her voice trembling. Did you have anything to do with it? Ellie stood, her hands clenched into fists. Are you serious? You think I'd do something like that? I don't know what to think, Michelle admitted, her voice breaking. You've kept secrets before. Ellie's face crumpled, the anger draining from her. I didn't do it, Michelle, I swear. Michelle studied her sister's face, searching for the truth. Then help me prove it, she said finally. Ellie nodded, her eyes filled with determination. I will. As Michelle returned to her room, a strange mix of relief and unease settled over her. Trust was a fragile thing, and while she wanted to believe Ellie, the doubts lingered. But one thing was certain. Until the truth was uncovered, the shadows of the fire would continue to haunt them all. The days following Michelle's confrontation with Ellie felt like walking through a fog. Suspicion clung to every corner of the house, and the once tentative but growing trust between Nate and Michelle seemed to waver under the weight of unspoken doubts. Ellie had promised to help clear her name, but the lack of immediate answers only deepened the tension. Sheriff Reeves returned to the house midweek, his presence bringing an unsettling gravity. He carried a folder under his arm, the kind that seemed heavy with answers no one wanted to hear. Nate and Michelle sat in the living room as Reeves placed the folder on the coffee table and began to speak. We've got more information about the fire, he said, his tone professional but not devoid of empathy. The accelerant we found at the scene matches a product sold at a hardware store just a few miles from here. Surveillance footage shows someone purchasing it the day before the fire. Michelle's stomach tightened. Who? She asked, her voice barely audible. Reeves hesitated, then pulled a photo from the folder. It showed a grainy but unmistakable image of Ellie, her leather jacket and ponytail clear as day. No, Michelle breathed, shaking her head. That doesn't mean anything. She could have been buying it for something else. Reeves sighed. I understand this is hard to hear, but the timeline and circumstances don't look good. We need to bring her in for questioning. Nate glanced at Michelle, his expression torn. Michelle? She didn't do it, Michelle snapped, standing abruptly. She wouldn't. But even as the words left her mouth, doubt gnawed at the edges of her conviction. Ellie had made mistakes. Big ones. Could this be another? When Ellie returned to the house later that evening, Michelle wasted no time confronting her. Sheriff Reeves has footage of you buying accelerant, she said, her voice trembling with both anger and fear. Why? Ellie's face paled, her defenses rising. It's not what it looks like. Then tell me what it is, Michelle demanded, her voice breaking. Ellie hesitated, her gaze darting toward the floor. I was scared, she admitted finally. I saw someone hanging around the house a few nights before the fire. I thought they might try something, so I bought it to scare them off. Michelle's breath caught. Scare them off? How? Ellie looked up, her eyes filled with desperation. I wasn't going to use it, I didn't know what else to do. The explanation didn't sit right with Michelle, but before she could press further, Nate entered the room, his expression unreadable. Reeves wants to see you tomorrow, he told Ellie. We're going together. Ellie nodded reluctantly, her usual defiance replaced with something that looked like shame. The following day, the truth began to unravel. At the sheriff's office, Reeves presented additional footage, this time of another figure entering the hardware store shortly after Ellie left. The man's face was partially obscured, but his movements were deliberate, calculated. "That's Michael Porter's assistant," Nate said suddenly, his voice laced with both realization and fury. Reeves nodded. "We're working on connecting the dots, but it looks like this wasn't random. Someone wanted to send a message." Nate clenched his fists, anger radiating off him. "He's been targeting me for months, but this is beyond anything I could have imagined." Michelle felt a strange mix of relief and guilt wash over her. Ellie wasn't guilty, at least not of the fire, but the fear and doubt had already taken their toll. She reached for Ellie's hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Ellie shook her head. "I get it. I haven't exactly given you reasons to trust me." Later that evening, back at the house, Nate gathered everyone in the living room. "We need to talk," he began, his tone serious but steady. "This isn't just about the fire anymore. Someone came after my family, our family, and we need to stand together." Michelle looked at him, the weight of his words settling over her. It was the first time he had openly included her and Ellie in that word, family. Despite everything, it felt like a turning point, a moment of clarity in the chaos. As the evening wore on, Nate and Michelle talked quietly in the kitchen. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice sincere. "I doubted you, doubted Ellie, when I should have trusted you." Michelle shook her head. "You had every reason not to trust us, but I want to earn it, for Emily, for all of us." Nate smiled faintly, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in days. "You've already earned more than you know." That night, as Michelle lay in bed, she felt something shift inside her. The shadows of her past hadn't disappeared, but they no longer felt as suffocating. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of healing, not just for herself, but for everyone in the house. The revelation of Michael Porter's involvement in the fire had shifted the tension in the Carter household into a sharp, unwavering resolve. Nate, usually measured and calm, was now driven by a singular focus, protecting his family and putting an end to Porter's interference once and for all. The sheriff's office had promised to investigate further, but Nate couldn't wait. He knew Porter too well. Every delay was a chance for his rival to cover his tracks. Michelle watched Nate closely in the days following the discovery. His usual warmth toward Emily and even her had given way to a quiet intensity. He spent hours in his study, poring over documents and making phone calls. Though he didn't say it outright, Michelle knew he was building a case, collecting every piece of evidence he could against Porter. Ellie, meanwhile, was determined to prove her loyalty. "I'm coming with you," she told Michelle one evening, as they stood in the kitchen, her voice firm. Michelle frowned. "Coming where?" "To confront Porter," Ellie said. "Nate's going to do it, I can feel it. And if he's walking into the lion's den, I'm not letting him do it alone." Michelle hesitated, torn between her desire to protect Ellie and her own growing need to stand by Nate. "We'll talk to him," she said finally. "But we have to be smart about this." The next morning, Nate announced his plan at the breakfast table. "I'm meeting with Porter today," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "It's time to end this." Deborah, who had been silently supportive throughout the ordeal, looked up sharply. "You think he's just going to admit to everything?" Nate shook his head. "No, but I have enough to corner him, enough to make him back off." Emily, sensing the seriousness in the room, looked between the adults with wide eyes. "Daddy, are you going to be okay?" Nate's expression softened as he knelt beside her chair. "I'll be fine, sweetheart. You don't need to worry." But Michelle couldn't shake her unease. Later, as Nate prepared to leave, she caught him by the door. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, her voice steady. Nate hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. "This isn't your fight, Michelle." "It is now," she replied. "Porter came after your family, our family. That makes it my fight too." Nate studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Okay, let's go." Ellie insisted on joining them despite Nate's protests. "I've got nothing to lose," she said simply, "and I'm not letting you two go in there without backup." They arrived at Porter's sleek downtown office just before noon. The air inside the building was cold and clinical, every surface polished to perfection. A receptionist led them to a conference room, where Porter sat waiting, his smile sharp and predatory. "Nate," Porter drawled, rising to shake hands. "I wasn't expecting such a lively entourage." "This isn't a social call," Nate said, his tone icy. "We know what you did." Porter's smile didn't waver. "You'll have to be more specific. I've done a lot of things." Nate dropped a folder onto the table. Inside were documents, emails, and photographs tying Porter's assistant to the arson. Porter glanced at the contents, his expression unreadable. "This is a good effort," Porter said finally, leaning back in his chair, "but it's circumstantial at best." Michelle stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You sent someone to burn down a house with a little girl inside. Circumstantial or not, people are going to ask questions, and you can't afford the answers." For the first time, Porter's confidence faltered. His eyes flicked toward Nate, who seized the moment. "You have two choices," Nate said, his voice low but firm. "Back off. No more threats, no more games, or I take this public. And believe me, the court of public opinion won't be kind to a man who endangers children." The room fell silent, the weight of Nate's words hanging heavy in the air. Porter's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. Finally, he leaned forward, his smile gone. "You think you've won," he hissed. "This isn't over." Nate met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, it is." As they left the building, Michelle felt a surge of relief and pride. For all his composure, Nate had faced down a man who had terrorized him for months, and he had done it not out of pride, but out of love for his family. Ellie clapped Nate on the back as they reached the car. "You've got guts, Carter. I'll give you that." Michelle smiled faintly as she slid into the passenger seat. For the first time in weeks, it felt like they were finally moving forward, together. The confrontation with Michael Porter marked a turning point for everyone in the Carter household. Though Porter had retreated, his venomous threat still echoed in their minds. But as the days passed, the tension began to ease, replaced by a quiet determination to move forward. The shadow Porter had cast over their lives was fading, and in its place, there was room for something new, something hopeful. Michelle found herself waking each morning with a lighter heart. The fear and uncertainty that had haunted her for years no longer felt insurmountable. Instead, she felt grounded in a way she hadn't since she was a child. This house, this family, it wasn't perfect, but it was becoming hers in a way she never thought possible. One evening, Michelle found Deborah in the kitchen slicing apples for Emily's dessert. The older woman's face, usually stern, was softer, her movements unhurried. "You've done a lot for this family," Deborah said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Michelle looked up from the counter, surprised. "I'm just trying to do my part." Deborah set the knife down and turned to face her. "It's more than that. I see the way Emily looks at you, the way Nate relies on you. You've brought something back into this house that I didn't think we'd ever have again." Michelle felt a lump rise in her throat. "I didn't do it alone." Deborah's lips curved into a small smile. "No, but you didn't have to stay, and yet, here you are." The conversation stayed with Michelle long after Deborah left the kitchen. She thought of Emily's laughter, Nate's steady presence, and even Ellie's attempts to rebuild their relationship. For the first time in years, Michelle let herself believe that she belonged, not just in the house, but in the lives of the people who had come to mean so much to her. Later that night, Nate found Michelle sitting on the porch swing, a steaming mug of tea cradled in her hands. He joined her without a word, the quiet night wrapping around them like a blanket. For a while, they simply sat together, the swing creaking softly as it swayed. "You've been quiet," Nate said finally, his voice low and calm. "Just thinking," Michelle replied, "about how far we've come." Nate nodded, his gaze fixed on the stars above. "It feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? The fire, Porter, everything." Michelle turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "And yet it feels like it all led us here, to this moment." Nate met her eyes, and for a moment, the weight of everything unspoken passed between them. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he said softly. "For Emily, for me, you've been a gift, Michelle." Michelle looked down, her cheeks warming under his gaze. "You don't have to say that." "It's the truth," Nate insisted. "You've given Emily something I couldn't. You've given her love, patience, and a sense of safety. And you've given me hope. Michelle felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away, a small smile breaking through. You've given me hope too, she said, more than I ever thought I'd have. The next morning, Emily bounded into Michelle's room, a colorful drawing clutched in her hand. Look what I made, she exclaimed, holding up a picture of the three of them standing under a big tree. Above them, in childlike scrawl, were the words, my family. Michelle's breath caught as she took in the image. It's beautiful, she whispered. Emily beamed. Do you like being part of our family? Michelle knelt to Emily's level, her heart full to bursting. I love it, sweetheart, more than you'll ever know. As Emily hugged her tightly, Michelle felt a profound sense of peace. The girl's warmth, her unwavering acceptance, was a reminder of everything Michelle had fought for, and everything she had gained. That evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, the conversation flowed easily, punctuated by Emily's giggles and Ellie's playful banter. For the first time, the house felt whole. The wounds of the past hadn't disappeared, but they were healing, slowly but surely. After dinner, Nate raised his glass, his gaze sweeping over everyone at the table. To new beginnings, he said, his voice steady, and to the family we've chosen. Michelle clinked her glass against his, her smile radiant. In that moment, she knew they were no longer just surviving. They were thriving, together. The days after Nate's heartfelt toast at dinner seemed to pass with a kind of quiet harmony that the house hadn't seen in years. The lingering scars of the fire and Porter's schemes were still there, but they no longer defined the family. Instead, they became markers of resilience, a reminder of what they had endured and how far they had come. Michelle woke up early one morning to the sound of laughter drifting in through her window. She peered outside to see Emily chasing Ellie across the backyard, their giggles filling the crisp autumn air. It was a sight that warmed her heart and solidified something she'd long suspected. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was home. Downstairs, Nate was in the kitchen, flipping pancakes with an ease that belied his usual seriousness. Michelle leaned against the doorway, smiling. Didn't know you could cook, she teased. Nate glanced over his shoulder, a playful grin lighting his face. It's a rare occasion, so enjoy it while it lasts. As they shared breakfast together, the warmth in the room was palpable. Even Deborah, who had always maintained a professional distance, seemed more relaxed, chiming in with stories from her childhood as Emily listened intently. Later that afternoon, Nate called Michelle into his study. She hesitated at the door, still unused to the idea of stepping into such an elegant space as though she belonged. What's up? She asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Nate gestured for her to sit, his expression serious but kind. There's something I want to talk to you about, he began. I've been thinking a lot about everything you've done for Emily, for me, for this house. You didn't just step into a role. You changed our lives. Michelle shifted in her seat, unsure of where he was going. Nate, you don't have to. Let me finish, he interrupted gently. When I first brought you here, I thought it was about helping Emily, and you have. But what I didn't realize is how much we needed you. All of us. You're more than just someone who works here. You're family. Michelle's breath caught. The words hit her harder than she expected, and she blinked rapidly, trying to keep her emotions in check. I don't know what to say. Say you'll stay, Nate said simply. Not as an employee, but as someone who belongs here, with us. Michelle nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She didn't need words to convey what she felt. Nate's expression told her he understood. That weekend, Nate surprised everyone by announcing a small celebration in the backyard. Friends, neighbors, and even some of Nate's colleagues gathered to mark a new chapter for the Carter household. The garden was strung with fairy lights, the air filled with the smell of grilled food and the sound of laughter. As the evening wore on, Emily pulled Michelle toward a small table where a blank canvas and paints were waiting. We're making a family picture, Emily declared, her eyes shining. Michelle hesitated, feeling a pang of insecurity. I'm not very good at painting, sweetheart, Emily giggled. That's okay. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be us. Together, they painted a colorful, slightly messy image of the house. the oak tree in the backyard, and the four of them standing hand in hand. Emily added a bright yellow sun and a rainbow for good measure, her enthusiasm infectious. When they were done, Emily held up the canvas proudly. "What do you think, Daddy?" Nate knelt beside her, his eyes soft as he took in the picture. "It's perfect," he said, glancing at Michelle. "Just like our family." As the evening wound down, Nate stood and tapped his glass to get everyone's attention. "I want to thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady and full of emotion. "This past year has been one of the most challenging of my life, but it's also been one of the most rewarding. Because in the midst of everything, I found something I didn't realize I was missing. A family." His gaze rested on Michelle, who felt her cheeks flush under the weight of his words. "To Michelle," he said, raising his glass, "for bringing light back into this house and showing us all what it means to care without limits." The crowd erupted into applause, and Michelle found herself pulled into a warm embrace by Ellie, who whispered, "Told you this place was good for you." As the stars began to twinkle above, Michelle stood with Nate and Emily, their arms around each other. For the first time in her life, she felt truly anchored, rooted in love and belonging. The road to this moment had been anything but easy, but it was worth every step. This wasn't just a new chapter, it was a new beginning. The days following the celebration in the backyard were filled with a quiet sense of relief and new beginnings. The Carter household had transformed. Once fraught with tension and unspoken fears, it now hummed with warmth and an undeniable sense of unity. The fire, Michael Porter, the shadows that had hung over them for so long, all of it was slowly fading into the past. In its place was something stronger, a family rebuilt from the fragments of brokenness. Michelle had never imagined she would find a place like this. It wasn't just the house or the garden or even the life she now shared with Nate and Emily. It was the love that filled every corner, the unwavering trust that had been built, piece by piece. She had found more than a job here. She had found a home. One evening, as Michelle stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, Emily bounded in, her face lit with excitement. "Guess what, Michelle?" she asked, her voice practically vibrating with energy. "My teacher asked if you could come to our class for a career day. She said you're the best." Michelle chuckled, her heart swelling. "I'm the best? What about your dad? He's the one with the fancy job." Emily shook her head. "Nope, you're better. You help me all the time and you're always here when I need you." The simple, sincere praise made Michelle's chest tighten with emotion. "You're sweet," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair out of Emily's face. "I'll think about it." As the evening wore on, Michelle found herself reflecting on the past few months, on how much her life had changed. When she first arrived at the Carter house, she had been filled with doubt, with fear of the unknown. She had spent so long surviving, never expecting to be part of something more. But here, with Nate, with Emily, and even with Ellie, she had learned to dream again. Nate found her later that evening, standing on the porch, gazing at the stars. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her quietly for a moment. "You're getting good at this," he said, his voice light but with an undercurrent of sincerity. Michelle smiled faintly, the weight of his words sinking in. "Getting good at what?" "Belonging," Nate said simply, his gaze steady. "You found your place here, haven't you?" She turned to him, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time she didn't feel the need to defend herself. There was no wall, no hesitation. "I have," she said, her voice strong but soft with the truth. "I never thought I would, but I have." Nate stepped closer, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "You've given Emily a future. You've given us all something we didn't know we needed. And for that, I'll be forever grateful." Michelle felt the weight of his words sink deep into her heart. This wasn't just a family, it was her family. She didn't need anything more. As the weeks passed, Michelle continued to settle into her role. More than a nanny now, more than just a caretaker. She was a mother figure to Emily, a steady presence in the house. And with each passing day, she became more integrated into their lives. Her bond with Emily grew stronger. The little girl was no longer just a child she cared for, but someone she cherished deeply. Ellie, too, had begun to find her place. She had made efforts to reconnect, to prove that she could be the sister Michelle had always wanted. Though their relationship was still complex, there were moments of real progress, conversations without the weight of resentment, shared laughs that felt natural. Michelle knew the road ahead wouldn't be perfect, but it was a road she was now willing to walk. One afternoon, as the family gathered around the table to discuss upcoming plans, Nate turned to Michelle. "We're thinking about taking a little trip next month. How does a weekend getaway sound? Just the three of us." Michelle's eyes lit up. It was something so simple, yet it filled her with a profound sense of belonging. A weekend getaway, no business, no lingering worries, just family. For the first time, she could see a future that wasn't clouded by uncertainty. "That sounds perfect," she said, her voice full of warmth. "Where are we going?" Nate grinned. "I thought we'd head to the mountains, some hiking, a cabin, a chance to relax without the usual distractions." Emily squealed with delight. "We can see animals and maybe catch some fish." The excitement in Emily's voice was contagious, and for a moment, Michelle allowed herself to picture the future. One where they all grew together, where the ties between them only strengthened with time. Later that evening, after Emily had gone to bed, Michelle and Nate stood outside watching the stars. The air was crisp, and the silence between them felt comfortable, familiar. "I never thought I'd be here," Michelle said, her voice quiet but full of emotion. Nate turned to her, his gaze warm. "You've more than earned your place here, Michelle. You've built something with us, and I can't imagine this house without you in it." She smiled softly, a tear slipping down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. It was a tear of gratitude, a tear for the family she had found, the love she had earned. "Thank you," she whispered, though the words felt inadequate. "Thank you for letting me be part of something so much bigger than I ever dreamed." As they stood together side by side, Michelle realized that this wasn't just a journey they had taken, it was a journey they were still on. There would be challenges ahead. There would be bumps in the road, but for the first time, she felt equipped to face them, knowing she wasn't alone. For the first time, she believed in the future.